So our topic in Module 2 is epistemology, right? How we know what we know is the way that we might describe that to lay people. In education, we might adapt that question a bit and think about what is worth knowing, right? What knowledge and what ways of knowing, what is worth knowing and thus learning, teaching and learning in school. So if we talk about knowing, the implication is teaching and learning as well, right? So that's the big question for the week that gets us thinking about epistemology. Now, of the 5 readings, they each serve a different purpose this week. The Noddings reading in some ways is the most dense because it's what I would describe as a definitional piece. So the Noddings chapter on epistemology and education, I include because I want you to understand that when we talk about epistemology philosophically, in the philosophical world, it's much broader than the way that we're talking about it here in education. Within education, it's a much narrower scope, right? But Noddings helps us to understand this broader field of epistemology and epistemological studies within philosophy. It helps us understand through Socrates, through Dewey, and through others, different ways and approaches and schools of thought about how we know what we know and why it matters to think about that. So the Noddings article has a couple, it's valuable for us in a couple ways. So the first way, again, is just giving us kind of a lay of the land. What do we mean when we're talking about epistemology? How do philosophers talk about epistemology? So that's one. 2, she specifically brings our attention towards this idea of constructivism, which is both philosophical and psychological, and thus also educative, right? And our reliance on constructivism is both philosophical, particularly in relation to John Dewey, but also psychological and neurological, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit, okay? And Noddings talks about how these are not interchangeable, right? Constructivism in psychology, constructivism in philosophy, they're not the same thing, but they are interconnected for us in education, maybe not for a philosopher, right? So that's the second value in the Noddings reading. And then the third value in the Noddings reading is I love the way that she goes through a couple different ways that educators may take up epistemological questions. And I love that she brings us to this question of what is worth knowing and helps us parse out what's the ethical concern here and what's the epistemological concern. That ethical concern we're going to come back to later in our week on justice. And in some of our other modules, but for now we're just going to deal with these epistemological questions of what is worth knowing. Okay, so constructivism is what we're guided by. This is different than Plato's allegory of the cave, okay? So Plato's allegory of the cave is, many of you are familiar with it from Philosophy 1001. You may have read it in other philosophical classes. It's sort of a classical philosophical piece that people read in getting acquainted with philosophical ideas, particularly about education and knowledge and learning, the role of the intellectual. So in many ways, this is kind of a classical understanding of the role of the teacher and the role of the educator, the role of the intellectual. Because remember, we have these prisoners in a cave who think, this all according to Plato, right? Via Socrates. So we have these prisoners in a cave who think that they know what's happening in the world. But what we come to find out is that actually what they think they know isn't the reality. It's a perception of reality, right? They're seeing shadows on the wall. And when the one prisoner is released out of the cave, right, travels out into the light, and we have the oh my gosh, I just blanked out the word, but the ailments of the eyes, right? The eyes are hurt, and I always think there about what happens when you go from darkness into the sun. How at first you can't see, right? You're like, oh, this hurts, and then your eyes slowly open up and you see colors, right? You see dimension, and there is a really accurate metaphor there for this idea of coming to see the truth, the light, right? There's a reason that we have this idiomatic expression of coming to see the light, meaning that we understand the truth of something. So there's kind of two parts to pay attention to here in Plato's allegory of the cave. One is simply what he's saying about experience versus truth, or perception versus truth. Yes, we all have our perceptions and they may be different, but according to Plato, there is an objective truth out there. And it's the intellectual's job, or the teacher's job, the philosopher's job, to help those that are in the cave to come back to the cave and do the difficult work of helping those who are in the cave, looking at the shadows, thinking that this is reality, helping them to see that this is not reality, that in fact what you see is wrong, right? Or distorted, or untrue. And there is some other objective truth out there. This idea that, well, we all experience the world differently and thus our knowledge is all. That's not what Plato is saying, right? This is not that each of our perceptions is ultimately valid. He would acknowledge, and he does acknowledge, that what we think we're seeing, we think what we're seeing is valid. And if we don't have the rest of the context, this may seem true, but it is not true. There is an objective truth out there, and it's the teacher's job to instill it. The philosopher, the intellectual's job to instill it. So this is a classical understanding of the role of the teacher that guided and has guided for millennia, really, the idea of what the teacher is. These other three readings stand in contrast because they take up this constructivist approach, this understanding that we construct meaning, that maybe there are objective truths, and then we're not going to go down the whole like postmodernist path of is there any objective truth. We're going to simplify, knowing that with the exception of one or two of you, we are predominantly teachers or educators or business people in training, and not philosophers in training, although I would say we are all philosophers at large. But let's oversimplify for now and acknowledge that we're oversimplifying it, okay? So we're not going to argue whether or not there's any truth with a capital T out there that can be known. What we are going to acknowledge is that in order to come to know the world, constructivists say that we make sense out of it. We construct meaning through dialogue, through relationships, through experience, through identity, right? Who we are, the knower, which Socrates wasn't concerned with. The knower influences what we know, right? That's part of at the heart of constructivism, that the knower influences what is known. If we take that idea of knowing, it has radically different implications for teaching. Those radically different implications do not mean then whatever anyone experiences and thinks they know is true, right? There would be no role for a teacher. There is a role for a teacher, but it's different than what Plato describes. So in Freire, we have a critique. Paulo Freire critiques this traditional banking approach, which is not necessarily what Plato is advocating, but is often how this process of sharing the truth is approached in schools, right? Which is simply that the teacher has the knowledge and the student doesn't. You are empty vessels, and I am depositing that knowledge into you. Here you go. This is the truth. Learn it. Tell it back to me. If you can tell it back to me, you've learned. Freire is telling us that this is an oppressive process, right? That it goes against our beings, our souls, what is human in us. And this oppressive process, according to Freire, is part of how oppressive social structures are maintained. Because if we become attuned in school to simply getting deposits of information put into us, that is how we can approach our social system. Right? And so in contrast, he points out this idea of problem-posing pedagogies, the idea that our experience of the world is a starting point for learning. It's not the end point, it's the starting point, and that we can ask questions about our world and then come to explore and inquire. And a teacher who has been trained, who has perhaps a broader base of formal knowledge than students, although not always, has a role in this process, almost like a curational role, right? Kind of like Dewey talked about curating the environment. the teacher in a problem-posing process has a role. And the teacher may have knowledge that the students don't, language that the students don't, but the students also have knowledge and language. So it's a reciprocal process between teacher and student who co-construct meaning, co-construct understanding together. The teacher is also a learner, and the learner is also a teacher. That's different than what Plato is describing, right? So this is one way of thinking about constructivism with a very clear social reconstructionist position, that schooling is part of how society is reproduced, and if we want to interrupt an oppressive society, we have to interrupt schooling, which means interrupting teaching, learning, and knowing. Okay, the First People's Principles of Learning is also in many ways an epistemological document about what is worth knowing, but it's also about how we know. And I included this because I want you to understand that all cultures, whether they use the word epistemology or not, have epistemological beliefs and philosophies, right? And we can see overlap between the First Nations. This comes from Canada, which is why it's called the First Peoples or the First Nations. But we can see overlap between these indigenous principles of learning and contemporary and ancient Western ideas about learning. We can see that overlap, but we can also see the differences. And part of that overlap is made explicit by the author of this document to help us see that indigenous ideas of learning have points of connection to, in particular, constructivist ideas of knowing and learning, okay? The First People's Principles of Learning really emphasize experience and relationships, community, history, sovereignty, place, the earth, that all of these influence what we know and how we know, and then what we do with that knowledge, and thus what is worth learning and knowing through education. Finally, the Rietenberg article, also really dense. I would say the Rietenberg is probably the densest after Noddings. Maybe you would disagree with me. I always have to really read this piece closely, and I find something new every time. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Derrida. If you're not, it's okay. You can still make sense out of what Rietenberg is saying, which is offering a way to think about something we talk about as place-based education or contextually relevant education, but to help us think about that not in an idealistic way. So one of the things that the epistemological philosophers critiqued, right, back to Socrates, but also Dewey, others, right, one of the things they critique is what we would say in fancy terms, like the reification of experience, that experience itself is some kind of pure form of knowing. Again, if we think about Plato's allegory of the cave, Plato's saying absolutely not. It is a way of knowing that isn't always true and often does not reflect the whole truth, okay? But in a constructivist push, there can be this reification of experience, which again, I saw in some of your comprehension assessments, right? We all have different ways of experiencing and knowing the world, and they're all equally valid. And it's some kind of pure, particularly in the context of place-based learning, it's like a pure romanticization of the local, of community, of experience, of space, of time. And Rietenberg helps us understand that all of these are important to how we experience the world and make meaning out of it, but each of them is embedded within social systems. And so part of what this article on a radical pedagogy of place is making clear is that constructivism, sense-making, an emphasis on place, experience, the local, also has to consider social structures, the social world, and power. Which, if we go back to Noddings reminded us of this, right? Like, we have to consider power in relation to knowledge. And ultimately, those questions of power become ethical questions, which again, we'll get to in our module on justice, but there are epistemological questions in there. about what is worth knowing, what makes something more worth knowing, learning, teaching than something else. I want to just say one quick piece before I let you go, which is constructivism has many links to neuroscience and what we're learning about how the brain works and what learning looks like on a neurological level. That much of what philosophers, particularly constructivist philosophers, have told us has been confirmed through neuroscientific research. We could take the really simple fact that learning is initiated in the it's not the reptilian part of the brain, but it is the metaphor that I use. I know that neuroscientists have a different part, but I think about the ancient, right, the center of our brain, the hippocampus, where the amygdala, the emotional core of our brain, controls memory. So think about that. Our emotions and memory are rooted in the same place. Learning is in many ways, neurologically, a process of remembering, of moving experiences in the world into short-term memory, working memory, long-term memory, which can then reshape pathways in the brain so that we have processes and pathways for making sense of what we experience. And it's rooted in emotion, right? Memory, that process is shared in the part of our brain that controls emotion. So when we say that learning is an emotional process, that's part of it. It's not just metaphorical, it's not just philosophical, it's neurological. And what does that mean for engaging with these epistemological questions in our classrooms? Now, the last thing that I want to say is about the film, If You Build It. So if you've already watched this film, great. If you haven't watched it yet, I want you to keep some of these ideas in mind. If you build it, I'm offering it to you as an application, an educational application of thinking about epistemology. And as you watch the film, I want you to think about what is this film saying about what is worth knowing and how we know what we know. Is this film taking a constructivist or a more classical, Platonian or Socratic idea about epistemology? Is this film engaging in the kind of romanticization of place and experience that's critiqued by classical philosophers and by Rietenberg? Right? That piece by Rietenberg is so interesting because it's saying, yes, we construct meaning through experience, but don't romanticize that experience. Let's think about what is yet to come. Let's think about communities in the making. Let's think about different contexts. Let's think about urban. So Rietenberg helps us expand and not romanticize an experiential way of coming to know the world. I also want you to think about the teachers, and are they occupying a problem-posing stance or a banking stance? How are they orienting themselves to their students and to what they learn? And are the teachers themselves engaging with epistemological questions or not? Are they taking it down the ethical path, right? Are they thinking more about moral issues, ethical issues, or are they thinking about how do we know what we know and what makes something worth knowing in a classroom or in a classroom space? So that you can then tie those into your papers.